So as you guys are munching on some wonderful snacks, I haven't got to get any yet because my wife has me on a diet. It's okay. Uh, it's a great thing, especially when you have a wedding ceremony coming up. So got to fit nice and slim, you know. But just kind of wanted to introduce myself to some of you who I haven't got a chance to meet. I'm Josh Childress. I'm the youth pastor here at Journey, and I'm really, really excited about tonight because, like I said earlier in any of the service that you might have been attending, is I love being able to partner with you because I'm going to be completely honest. You have more power than I could ever dream of. And what I mean by that is that you're with your student, with your elementary student or your college student or your grandchildren more than I get to be. And the more we can be on the same page, the greater I feel like our ministry will grow. And I don't mean by numbers, but I mean by impact for the kingdom of God. And I learned a long time ago, I got humbled very early in ministry. I know I'm super young. I know I look 38. Some people think my wife is my daughter. Super weird sometimes. Like, I'm just kidding. It's not that bad. She makes it worse because we just got a puppy too. Like, we just got a little puppy. And she'll be like, come on, let's go with dad. And I'm like, babe, stop. There's people. It just does not help. We go in the elevator, we're like, oh, you guys are so cute. Father and daughter walking the, and it's like, oh my God, whatever. But again, I just wanted to introduce myself. I know there's a lot of you I haven't got a chance to meet or get to connect with. And kind of just want to even share a little bit about me real quick so you kind of feel like you know me on a personal level. Number one, and you'll hear me say it from stage, I'm a Cowboys fan. So let's just get that out of the way real quick so we can actually get to what's important. But I have a beautiful wife, Amy. Amy, kind of wave your hand so everybody can see you. She's my partner in crime. Without her, I fail in life. Let's just be honest. And with her, I succeed greatly beyond my capacity. Childress. My last name is Childress. Childress. So we're in this together. We kind of have a wonderful group of volunteers who are helping develop your teenagers and your middle schoolers and your future elementary schoolers and grandkids and all that stuff. But again, what I want to continue to encourage you in this is for you. Because, and we kind of talked about it actually a few minutes ago with our high school students, I know that you guys are tired of reading headlines as much as I am. I've been here for a short amount of time, been here since October, and in my 6 years in North Carolina, we had one. And to come in, it's been heartbreaking for me and my wife, and it's been a weight that we've been carrying, and this is a way for us to walk together, to fight together, to do it together, because I'm going to be honest, we can't do this on our own. We need help, and we believe that the greatest help we could ever get is you guys, because we want to help you be as successful as you can. I don't want your students 20 years down the road and say, man, the only influence I had spiritually was my youth pastor. I want to be like the fourth or fifth. I want you guys to be 1 and 2. I want you guys to be the top impact and influencers in their life. And this is Rick. Everybody say, hey, Rick. Hey, Rick. Rick is a phenomenal leader, and you can even read through some of the stuff that he's already prepared for us. He's going to give you guys, and even I'm up here too, so if you have questions, feel free to bounce it off both of us. Going to give you a lot of great content to run with. And our goal is for this not to be the one and only, but this to be the first of many. And so I believe this is a great place for us to start in the journey, the journey of where God is calling us to go together. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick. I love you guys. I'm so excited that we get to do this together. And feel free to come up with me anytime after. We'd love to get to know you by name and love to help continue to get connected. So Rick, floor is yours, man.
Thanks, Josh. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. And thank you guys for coming tonight. I know this is a day of rest. So for you to come out, and especially to engage in something like this, shows a lot of courage and commitment and determination on your part. So thank you. And I know that in this room, we have a wide diversity of connections to young people who are struggling. Some of you concerned about what could happen in the future. Some of you already in it, having been through some really difficult things. I just want to say to those of you who've been closely connected to tragedy or trauma, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And one thing I know is that because of that trauma, everything is magnified. So I want to apologize in advance, because it's very easy when you're doing something like this to come off as though there's a silver bullet or there's certain things you can do that would have kept this trauma from happening. And we all know that this is a broken world and we're messy people. And so I want to apologize in advance, especially for those of you who have a close connection to trauma. If anything I say sounds formulaic, it isn't. I just want to acknowledge that from the beginning. So, and I asked you to kind of move forward and get close to people, because you are going to be talking together tonight and talking all of us as a group, because when you just sit and listen to somebody, who knew, but transformation rarely happens when you just sit and listen to somebody. You have to engage around whatever, and what better thing to engage about than this? We need to be talking about this. So I'm going to start off right off the bat by asking you to get with one other person, and I just simply want you to share with them, why did you come tonight? And those of you who are partnering together, when your partner says, here's why I came tonight, your responsibility is to ask follow-up questions. Don't just take the first answer that they give. Ask a question beyond their first answer, especially questions that have the word why in them. Why is the pearl of great price question? So I want everyone in here to have at least one person they can talk to about this, and just simply share, here's why I came here tonight. And partners, your job is to ask follow-up questions. So if you're not sitting near anybody right now, if you could move so that you're near somebody right now. I know it feels awkward, but we're going to be doing this the whole time, so you might as well get started. So if you could move towards someone, get near someone if you don't have a partner. And I'm going to give you a minute to simply talk about, why did you come tonight?
And if you're not meeting anybody new, is this really church? Come on, we got to meet new people, build some new relationships. Come on now.
All right, go ahead and draw your conversation to a close. So here's what I'm going to do now. I want to write as fast as I can, represent the reason that you came tonight. So if your reason is the same one that I've already put up here, don't call that out. But let's see if I can get 6 or 7 of these bullets real quick, just so we know what's happening in the room right now. All right? So just call it out and I'll write it.
Be better parents.
Better parent. What else? Sorry, what was that?
Get connected.
To get connected. Okay? Connected to, let me just ask a question about that. To connected to others? Connected to others. Okay. What else?
Increased communication.
Increased communication relative to your teenager? Okay. What else?
Trust.
I'm sorry, what? Trust? Trust, what do you mean by that?
Create trust between my kid and
Create trust. Okay. What else? Understanding, and again, I'm going to ask you, what do you mean by that?
Understanding what the kids are going through and just the differences and how we were raised and
Yeah,
face to face.
good. What else?
worries about divorce on my daughter.
Worries about divorce.
My divorce on my daughter.
Okay. Impact of divorce. Okay. Scared about everything. I think that, isn't that what Charlie Brown's problem was? Scared of everything? One more. Suicide. What was the other one? What do you mean by that? Okay? Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Josh?
One of the things that I wanted to mention to you, kind of in the midst of that little exercise, is not only do we need your help, but you need each other's help. And there's the old saying that it takes a village. Here's the village. Don't be afraid to make those connections, ask those questions. And like you were mentioning, get connected. Get connected to one another so that you guys can continue to help each other in this season and in this moment.
Good deal. So just a brief overview of what the next 45 or 50 minutes is going to look like. So I'm going to throw some stuff out there for you. I'm going to have you interact with a few things. I'm going to have you practice at least one thing. And at any point, if you have a question, it's okay to stop what's going on and ask your question. If it's not in the direction we're going in that moment, I'll say we'll get back to that. If it is, then we'll deal with it right then. There will also be some time at the end for any question that you might have that wasn't addressed. But the one reason why I wrote these up is to make sure that I'm aware, as we move through this, what it is you came here wanting. So I just want to be conscious of all that stuff. So if I happen to miss something, there'll be time toward the end also to ask questions. So I wanted to first introduce you to a guy named Admiral Jim Stockdale. Those of you who are a bit older, that name might ring a bell because he was Ross Perot's vice presidential running mate. That's what he's most known for. But actually, this guy is a war hero. He was the highest ranking military officer imprisoned during the Vietnam War. He was in the Hanoi Hilton for 8 years. His plane was shot down over enemy territory. He parachuted down. He parachuted into an enemy village where as soon as he hit the ground, they attacked him and almost killed him. They dragged him off to this torture facility, nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton, and he survived for 8 years under the most incredible conditions. He was tortured more than 20 times. He led the sort of counter-revolutionary uprising amongst the prisoners there in the Hanoi Hilton. But he saw many, many people not make it. But he did. In fact, because of his resistance work, he was put in solitary confinement for most of that 8 years in a cell that was not tall enough for him to stand up in, with a bare light bulb that was on 24 hours a day. So when he was finally released, he could not walk. He had to relearn how to walk. He went on to have a very successful life, public life, and along the way he met the business author Jim Collins, who wrote a book called Good to Great. Anyone ever heard of Good to Great? It's the best-selling business book of all time. Jim Collins happened to meet him and had been wanting to meet him for a long time because he was fascinated with how Jim Stockdale had survived 8 years of torture and gone on to a very productive life when many others hadn't. And so in this conversation with Jim Stockdale at a cocktail party, Stockdale told him how he survived. Jim Collins took that conversation and condensed it down to something he called the Stockdale paradox. And here's the Stockdale paradox. You must confront the brutal reality in front of you without giving up your prevailing hope. So you must confront the brutal reality while maintaining your prevailing hope at the same time. So there's a tension between those two things, right? So most of us come from a family that tends toward one extreme or the other. In my family, they hated brutal reality growing up, so we never talked about the elephant in the room, right? We only talked about positive, hopeful things, which is unhealthy. And the other extreme is also unhealthy, when all you ever do is talk about brutal reality and you squash hope. Jesus lived in perfect tension between these two things, between the two extremes of brutal reality and prevailing hope. He lived in perfect tension. This is actually a great filter when you're reading Jesus. Think of the Stockdale paradox whenever you're seeing Jesus encounter anyone, and ask yourself, how is he confronting brutal reality, and how is he upholding prevailing hope in the same moment, in the same interaction? You'll see he does it every single time he encounters someone. So the first thing we need to do tonight, I think, is to embrace some brutal reality. because there's the reason that Jim Collins wrote about the Stockdale paradox is because he discovered this is a truth, this tension is a truth for all who will survive difficult situations. Everyone who survives a difficult situation has somehow lived out the Stockdale paradox in their ability to survive. We're facing an epidemic, a crisis in our culture today, and it does no good to not acknowledge some of the elephant in the room. So I'm saying this because we're going to start this way, and there's a reason for it. Not to overshadow the hope, but to live in some tension. So the Stockdale paradox, when you think about brutal reality, a lot of us know that suicide is the number one killer now of young people, and it's the number 4 killer of adults. This did not happen accidentally. It's actually also getting worse. So younger people, the younger generation has a higher rate of suicide. It's getting worse the longer we go on. So we live in the most affluent culture in the history of the world. Let me say that again. We live right now, you and I, in the most affluent culture, top to bottom, in the history of the world. That has had a lot of great consequence for us. Healthcare, well-being, all kinds of things come when you are not struggling in poverty, right? There's also a nasty side effect of affluence that has been sort of buried under the rug for a long time. It's hard to embrace that there might be some nasty side effect from something everybody in the world wants. But the nasty side effect has played out over and over again in a culture sort of gripped by anxiety and suicidal thoughts. So we live in when you live in a culture that has great affluence, your day-to-day struggles do not normally have to do with your physical survival. That does something to our mental health because our life energy shifts from surviving physically to performing. Let me say that again. Our life energy shifts from trying to survive just physically to performing. So the more affluent the society, the greater the performance mentality. And the more affluent the society, you can see if you plot the pockets of great affluence in America, you will also be plotting the highest rates of suicide in our country. I wrote about this in a book I wrote a little while ago called Spiritual Grit, and I expected a lot of upset people to pick that out and say, how can you say such a thing? And I've talked to lots of mental health professionals since then, and they all agree. This is something that is happening, and it's not being talked about. So we can't help the time and season of the world that we live in. We live in an affluent culture. What we can help is to have our eyes opened to some of the side effects of what that means in our culture. So, here's a question. Because we live in a performance culture, if you just swim with the current of our culture, the culture will take you places. So the people that don't flow with the current of the culture are those that are countercultural. They've decided to go upstream, right? So in our culture, because it's performance-based, most people, even though if you asked them, is success in your career the key to happiness, they'd say, oh, no. There's other things more important. But if you examine the behavior of how we operate as a culture, you'd have to say that's what we believe. We believe that high performance, so the right school, the right career, the right salary, will lead to happiness because we sacrifice so many things, functionally sacrifice so many things to make that happen, even though the research shows that none of those things promote happiness. Here's a shocker for you. This whole idea of the relationship between affluence and happiness is a big subject of research right now. And one of the things they discovered is that if you reach a certain baseline of economic foundation, which is quite low, it's in the 30,000s as a family, if you reach that kind, and that's officially, you would be considered in this country under the poverty line. But the researchers have found that if you reach a certain base level, foundational level of an economic foundation of in the low 30,000s, that your level of happiness is not appreciably affected no matter how much more you make after that. It's affected up to that point. That makes sense, doesn't it? If you're living in poverty and on the street, it makes sense. But past that, it has very little impact on your long-term happiness. That's hard for us to believe, and it's even harder for us to live that out. So we become sort of unwitting participants in a performance culture. So in a performance culture, the battleground shifts from just finding enough food to eat the next day to comparison to everyone around you relative to whether you're performing well or not. Am I doing well enough? So in my household, I have a daughter in college and a 16-year-old who's a sophomore at Arapahoe High School. And my wife and I have consciously, over the course of our parenting, not expected our kids to be, incredible students. We don't put pressure on them to get good grades. I guess that's the safest way. In fact, we try to pull them back sometimes when they're sacrificing too much of their life for this. Nevertheless, I have two girls who believe that performance is necessary for their identity. Why? Because they live in a culture that upholds that kind of performance. There are some nasty side effects from that. So here's the question, and you don't have to answer this. This is the one time when I'm going to ask you a question. I don't want you to answer it. But it's an important question to ask yourself, thinking about flowing with the current or not flowing with the current in our culture. The question is, are you more concerned about your son or daughter's accomplishments or who they're becoming? Are you more concerned? Concerned means paying attention to, maybe even worried about, anxious about. Are you more concerned with their accomplishments or who they're becoming? It's a good question for you to give an honest answer to, and an honest answer that says, actually, if I think about it, I think I emphasize their accomplishments, their achievements. I never thought about it before, but I think I actually do. Well, welcome to the club. You live in a culture that promotes that. And if we're not conscious and moving countercultural from it, of course we'll flow with it. So it's an important diagnostic question to ask, because if you're not asking, if you're not more concerned about who your kids are becoming, you will certainly feed into their performance stuff within the culture. It's impossible to get away from. So suicide, the most severe form of what we're talking about tonight, is a mental health issue, no doubt about it. But it's also an identity issue. And I'm going to come at this from a little bit of an unconventional trajectory here. I'm not a mental health professional. There are people in the congregation that are. I just had a great conversation with one of them outside. And we have some information here about mental health resources. So there are certainly situations with our young people where they desperately need mental health care from trained professionals. There's no doubt about it. Tonight, I'm going to approach this from a different trajectory. So I just want to make sure that you understand that dichotomy. So find a place where you can write on your empty place on your notes or somewhere there. And I just want you to, this is a question I want you to write an answer to yourself about. You're not going to share this one with your partner, but here's the question. In your family, apart from each other, what do you love the most in life? In your family, apart from each other, when you really think about it, what is the thing that I love the most? Just write that on your piece of paper. You're not going to have to share this with anyone. So just be brutally honest with yourself. What is the thing you love the most? All right, take a look at what you've written. Just stare at that for a second. Let it sink in. And then recognize whatever you just wrote down is forming your identity, and it's forming the identity of your family. It's not what we promote. It's not even what we believe. It's what we love the most that forms identity in our family. So if you look at what you just wrote down, and if you had to write underneath that, here's what I wish I loved the most. Here's what I wished I had answered. If you take a look at the gap between those two things, there's room there for you to explore in and of yourself. The fact that you wished you loved something that you didn't write down is saying something about your own trajectory in life. But there's no getting around the fact that kids sense what their parents love the most, and their identity orbits around that, whatever it is. You can't help it. It's not about what you repeat and say to them, it's what they sense you love the most. So here, a little rabbit trail, by the way. This is why I've sort of given my life, especially for the last 15 years, at helping people encounter Jesus as he really is, so that they naturally develop a passion for his heart, not because they should, but because they've been captured by his heart. Because when your highest love in life is a passion for Jesus, it naturally forms you and everyone around you around that passion. And why is that so important relative to what we're talking about tonight? So many kids who are struggling don't see their identity tenable outside of circumstantial success or happiness in their life. But when your passion is for Jesus, it transcends your circumstances. That's why people who love Jesus but have a lot of horrible things happening in their life can still say, I love Jesus, even in the midst of this, because a love for Jesus transcends your circumstantial reality. And a lot of kids today cannot get outside of their circumstantial reality. Their hope has a ceiling. So in your family, if your intention, if what you wished you had written down is, I wish that the greatest love I had in my life was a deeper passion for Jesus, there is a way forward to that. It doesn't drop out of the sky magically. It's slowing down to appreciate and pursue his heart. Because when you get close to his heart, he's like radiation. The closer you get to him, the more you are radiated by him. Or he's like a black hole in the universe. You know, black hole is the densest matter in the universe. There's a thing called the event horizon. If you cross over the event horizon in space, and that means that you've crossed over the point of no return, and you are for sure going to be grabbed into the gravitational pull of the black hole. Jesus is like that. You get close enough to him, gravity takes over. Gravity takes over, he conquers your heart. Your highest passion is him. You're forming identity in your home when this happens. But you are forming identity around whatever it is you love the most. So that might answer a few questions for you as well. That takes some real self-introspection. So we're going to talk a little bit about now about some of the outcomes of this culture we're talking about, and then we're going to move into some pragmatic things, and then we'll have some questions. So in this performance comparison culture, we talk a lot about social media and technology, and relative to online bullying and things like that. There's always been bullying, by the way. What has changed bullying is that kids can't get away from it now. I was bullied when I was a kid. I got in lots of fights when I was in junior high school. I went to a really rough high school, and I literally thought there were times when I was going to get killed because I had some guys who just picked on me, and I had to learn how to stand up and fight. So bullying has always been hard. But once I confronted those bullies, I could go home, and they couldn't get at me anymore. And today's kids, they're surrounded. Because of technology, they have no way out. It feels like there's no hope. So it's an important distinction that it's not that we're going to eradicate bullying from our culture. It's not going to happen. We're broken people. But the fact that kids don't feel they can ever get away from it is a serious issue. It undermines their hope. They need a respite from it. They need to feel like they can get away from it. That's part of our performance and comparison culture. The other part of this is that they're surrounded by too muchness. Scotty talked about this a couple weeks ago, I think, that we're in a culture where there's too many choices. We are inundated with choices and information, and we are not wired to be able to ingest all of the tragedy and hardship of the world, but we're exposed to it every minute of the day. We are not wired, only God is wired to handle the weight of the world. We are not. But we live in a culture where there's too much information coming in at us. It also undermines our hope. And the main thing I want to spend the rest of our time just trying to focus on tonight is a result of all of this that we've been talking about is that destructive narratives get planted in the story, of kids' lives. So if you think about a computer has an operating system, right? An operating system is software that controls the functioning of the computer. It defines its abilities and capabilities, and it allows you to communicate with the computer. The operating system in human beings is story. Let me say that again. The operating system in human beings is story. It's the story you tell yourself, and it's the story you accept from others. And it's the story that you receive and invite and live that Jesus is telling you about yourself. But we all have a story that we've embraced about ourselves. It's the closest way to describe what our identity is. Whatever the conversation you have with yourself that no one else can hear is an indicator of what your identity is all about. So, and that identity is based in story. So we have an enemy, Jesus tells us, who's come to kill, steal, and destroy. How does he do it? He's not really that interested in your physical body. I mean, he kills you physically, and our promise is we live for eternity with Jesus in the presence of Jesus. That doesn't do it for Satan. He wants to destroy our identity. When we say our soul, that's what the identity is. His target is on the identity of people. We also know that 93% of all those who ever come to Christ do so before the age of 18. So where does the enemy have his target? He has it squarely on young people and those who work with them, parents, youth leaders, others. So he's come to kill, steal, and destroy. The way he does this is he plants destructive narratives in our story that we first, at some point, stop resisting and embrace. All of us have them. One of mine, growing up in a family where my parents were narcissists, meant that I grew up thinking that I was invisible. So I thought the thing that explained everything in my life is that I must be invisible. There must not be something in my soul where the soul is supposed to be, because that would explain my parents' behavior. So I grew up thinking that I was nothing inside. Therefore, I had to construct a personality, construct a characteristic. That worked to help me survive my family until I got to be a young adult. And then it started to destroy me. It almost cost me my marriage. It almost destroyed the things that were most precious to me. Because why? Satan creeps into the field at night, plants weeds in the wheat field, right? He plants bugs in our operating system. And if you have a computer with a bug, it's either going to slow it down or destroy the capability of the computer. So destructive narratives, I think, are the source of a lot of the internal struggles that kids are having today. And what makes it worse is they often hide them. They might journal about their destructive narratives, but they'd never tell anyone or rarely tell anyone. Those bugs operate under the radar, but they are convinced that they're true. And the longer they're allowed to stay there, the more dangerous they get. And in their heightened dangerous form, those destructive narratives grow so much, just like a weed amongst the wheat. They grow so tall that kids begin to believe that that's not something outside me, that is me. That destructive narrative is who I am, and I don't deserve to live anymore because of it. So it's the destructive narratives that we really have to surface in some way, isolate, and then partner with Jesus to uproot. Jesus, remember, said in that parable of the wheat and the weeds, no, let the weeds grow with the wheat because you'll uproot the wheat. But later on, I'm going to direct how to uproot those weeds, but we're going to rip them up. We are going to pull them up. So how do we partner with Jesus in his weed pulling strategy? So the first step, we're going to talk about this, is dragging what grows in the darkness into the light. So light actually has the power to kill virus there's some new science in the medical world right now that is using high density light to kill virus and other attackers inside the human body, because just exposure to light can kill it. So everything in the world is a metaphor. Romans 1 says that. Everything is a metaphor for the character and personality of God. So light not only lights up this room, but it actually goes after the darkness and eradicates it. So light is the first step toward getting a destructive narrative pulled out of a kid's life. So what does that mean exactly? We're going to explore a few different ways to get these things from the darkness into the light. None of them are frontal. Jesus told a parable called the parable of the shrewd manager. He told this story of this odious guy who was reprehensible in every single way, except for one. He was quite shrewd. Why would Jesus tell a story about a guy that none of us like, except for one quality, his shrewdness? It captured me, and I wrote a whole book called Shrewd about this because I wanted to learn what shrewdness meant. It essentially means sideways leverage. So Jesus was always using sideways leverage to bring transformation in people's lives, not frontal leverage. So like for instance, when my default setting, when my daughter says something, like Scotty said this morning, that your daughter said something that you knew was a lie, and our default setting, and mine is too, is to immediately say that's not true. This is who you really are. But what is your experience, generally speaking, when you do that? That is a frontal approach to their destructive narrative. And it's like in the old Star Trek show when Kirk told Scotty to divert all power to the front shields of the Enterprise, right? Well, that's what happens with a destructive narrative. It has a survival instinct, and it diverts all power to the front shields. As soon as somebody tries to address it frontally, all of that power is diverted to the front shields, and they push off whatever it is you're trying to say to them. So shrewdness means coming sideways. Now, this takes some conscious thought. I've been trying to live this out in my own parenting and my own life for many years now. I just asked Jesus, I want to get better at being shrewd because you said this was so important. So I started on a mission in my life to become more shrewd, to use sideways leverage. What does that look like? Here's some examples. These are things that you can do today if you want to. And let me just say this, by the way, these are just a menu of opportunities. These are not shoulds. I'm not telling you to do all these things. I'm saying if something resonates with you and you're like, yes, I like that, I can do that, then you're accountable to try it. If I say something, you're like, what? I would never do that. Then don't do it. Don't do it. Just seek after whatever your heart goes after. So the first thing is to go first. How many of you tell the real story of your struggle and challenge in life? How often do you tell your kids, here's how I struggled, not just 20 years ago, but today? In our family, we try to be honest about what's actually happening in us all the time. And I'll tell you why this is so important in just a second. A while back when my daughter, Emma, was younger, and we were struggling, our first daughter was like so easy to parent. And then the second one came along, right? And she's not anything like the older one, and she was just outside of our capacity. We were at our wits' end. We went to a counselor and said, we need some help. And we told her that there was a traumatic thing that had happened in my wife's family along the way that we had decided not to tell our kids. And she said, why did you do that? And we said, because we don't think they're, old enough to handle it. We're not sure they're old enough to handle it. The council looked at us and said, they already know. They already sense this thing this big weighty thing that all of your behavior and actions is kind of walking around. They already sense something is there and they're filling in the blank. It would be much better if they knew exactly what it was. For my wife and I are like, you've got to be kidding. But we went and one by one told our daughters in different ways with different levels of detail because they're 4 years apart. And we were amazed at how relaxed our two kids became when they knew the truth. And they started helping us deal with that traumatic thing in my wife's family instead of resisting it all the time. They became our partners in it. So I learned something really important from that counselor, that if you are keeping things from your kids that you think, especially if they're teenagers, that you think are too much for them, it's not true. Now that might be true with little kids, but it's not true with teenagers. They already sense it, and they need to know the truth. So I am frequently telling my kids of what a dork I have been in my life, the stupid decisions I've made, the emotional immaturity that I've exhibited not just 20 years ago, but yesterday. I'm telling them all the time my own challenges and struggles. Why is this so important? Because kids need to see that life is possible past these things. And if they don't sense that in you, you're unintentionally communicating to them that there is a ceiling which they can't go beyond because there's nothing beyond that. You need to blow out their ceilings and share with them your real life. Just do it naturally. Don't say, I've been meaning to talk to you about some of my real weaknesses. There are plenty of opportunities for this to come up organically, especially when your kids share about their challenges. When you fully hear them and then say, when you were sharing, I thought about myself too. You wouldn't believe this, but blank. My kids have heard so many stories like that, and they're used to it now. They understand that life is possible past the terrible big thing that's happening in their life right now because we tell stories. So leadership means going first. You are the leaders in your family, so go first. So that's one. That's sideways, by the way. So you're not frontally going after their destructive narrative. You're coming from the side, right? And giving them permission to hope past where they think they can go now. The next one is ask why questions. And on your handout, I have a little bit about asking why questions somewhere down below there. But let me just give you a quick understanding of this. I'm going to have you practice this real quick. Asking why questions means that when you're talking with your kids, get better at asking questions. A question that doesn't work is, how was your day? Right? Parents of teenagers, how many times have you asked that question and you've gotten the word fine as a response? Or okay, or even just a grunt, right? So how was your doesn't work because it's not specific, surprising, or personal. It's none of those things, and that's the three filters Jesus used for his questions: specific, surprising, and personal. Why questions, look at the number of times Jesus asked why. Why is a miracle question. So I'm going to have you practice with this just for a minute. That same partner you were talking with before, here's what I'd like you to do. I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to do this. So you're going to have to go quickly. And your mission with your partner is to ask follow-up questions that have the word why in them. You cannot ask a follow-up question that doesn't have the word why in it. All right? So here is the question I want you to ask or talk about with your partner. What's something you wish you could change about yourself? Isn't that a fun one? What's something you wish you could change about yourself? And I'm going to give you, decide who's going to go first, and I'll tell you when to stop and switch partners. All right? But partners who are pursuing first, you're the one asking the question. Only ask why follow-up questions. Like, well, why do you think that? Or why this and not that? Ask why questions, all right? Ready, set, go. What's something about you that you wish you could change? Go. All right, if you could bring that to a close. So I gave you a little bit of time to practice, but not a lot. So most likely you can just nod your head or change your body so that I know whether this is true or not. most likely that was difficult on some level to confine yourself to just why questions, right? It took some real thought, and you had to be creative inside about that. So we can either continue as parents to be default, and I often relegate myself to default questions still, or we can say, I want to ask more why questions with my kid. And I want to make our conversations full of why, because why gets at the heart, and that's where the destructive narrative is planted. So you need them to talk about their heart. Somehow, some way, these sideway conversations we're talking about, going first, sharing your own story, why questions, we are trying to surface the heart because that's where the destructive narrative is planted. We have to surface where it is in the darkness. So the more you do this, the more likely you are to see where the destructive narrative is. It'll come out sideways. It'll come out in a whispered comment. It'll come out in something they text their friend right after you've had the conversation, and you see them texting it. It'll come out sideways. The more you ask why questions, it's trying to surface their heart. Another way is to do something together that is a third focus. So a third focus is something that you're both focused on outside of each other. When you were a kid and you were in art class and you were working on an art project, you often probably had really good conversations with the person next to you because you were focused on something outside of yourselves, and it gave you this permission to have a more relaxed conversation. So find a third focus. For us in our family, we watch a lot of films. And the film gives us a third focus to talk about. So while we're watching the film sometimes, and sometimes almost always after the film, we have a conversation about the themes and beliefs and the kind of embedded truths in that film. And it gets at the heart because you're talking about a third focus on a heart level. And it allows kids to talk in a way that they normally wouldn't. So a third focus could be other things than film. It could be a book that you're reading together. It could be a hobby that you do together. It could be a team that you really enjoy together. It's a third focus outside of yourselves. Put yourself in more environments where you have a third focus because it greases the skids for conversation. And you want more conversation. Because why? We're looking for the destructive narratives in their heart. One last one. Study your kids' vulnerability style. It sounds funny, doesn't it? Study your kids' vulnerability style. So just a quick example of this. My daughter Lucy's a sophomore in college. My daughter Emma is a sophomore in high school. Daughter Lucy, I could have a frontal conversation with her at the drop of a hat, and she would go to a deep place, like right away. She's just relaxed and trusting. And my younger daughter Emma, she wants nothing to do with conversational pursuit, I would say. I have been challenged to my core in asking her questions because she's very elusive. But she's not elusive when we walk the dog around our neighborhood. For some reason, when we're walking the dog, a third focus, she will talk in a natural way. She'll bring up stuff. So we've learned, my wife and I have learned, let's invite Emma to go on a walk with our dog more often than we normally would because she talks. My daughter Emma also will write things that are very true about her heart. When she would never say them, she would write them. So sometimes we ask her to write about stuff. Or we're in situations where I literally will say, can you write out what you're feeling instead of us talking about it? Because I know that's easier for you, and you're a really good writer. So we've learned a lot about Emma's heart just from what she writes. That's her vulnerability style. So in order to understand your kids' vulnerability style, you're going to have to pay closer attention to them, to study them. So let's do this real quick. This is an example, by the way, I mentioned, we're talking right now about sideways conversations to surface the destructive narrative. The second part of this is sideways strategies. Once you've surfaced that narrative, what can you do to partner with Jesus to start plucking those out? So in transition into that, I'm going to give you a quick understanding of how shrewdness works. I said it comes sideways. Here's how shrewdness works. The first thing you have to do is understand how things work. So you have to study the person to understand how they work. I just told you some things I've learned about Emma. Those are things how she works. So I told you that we studied the fact that she talked more when we took the dog for a walk. So my wife and I then are on purpose, intentionally taking advantage of that openness that she has when we're walking the dog to ask her questions she would never answer in any other situation. So once you understand how things work, then you concoct an experiment that involves leverage. You concoct an experiment that involves leverage, and then you apply the leverage and see what happens. So that's what we do with my daughter. When we first started doing this, my wife and I, we said, let's try asking her this the next time we go on a walk with our dog and see what happens. We asked her and she opened up. So what we learned was the leverage worked. And then you repeat it until it doesn't work. And then you try another experiment that comes sideways and implies leverage. Leverage means it has power to move something. So shrewdness means understanding how things work, picking a point that you think you could leverage based on that understanding, trying something, and then seeing what happens. And then if it works, you use it again. So in the case of vulnerability style, it involves first understanding how things work. So why don't you write in your notes right now what you think. Just pick out one of your kids. If you only have one, this will be easy. But if you have more than one, pick out one of your kids and write what you think their vulnerability style is. Meaning, when are they most likely to open up and show their heart? What are they doing when that happens? What's going on around them when they happen to do that? So write down what you think the vulnerability style of one of your kids is. Raise your hand if you've written something down already, just so I know where the group's at. Okay, about 2/3 of you. Okay. What I'd encourage you to do if you're here with your spouse, or if you're not here with your spouse, ask them to do this when you get home, and then compare. Don't tell your spouse if they're not here, don't tell them what you wrote. Just ask them, what do you think the vulnerability style of this particular child is, and explain what that is, and have them write it down. Then compare. My wife and I had to do this a lot. We compare all the time. Are you sensing what I'm sensing? And we just kind of figure out reality relative to my daughter. And then if Emma ever knew how much we strategize behind the scenes and have it come out organically, normal, not weird. I'm so glad she's not here right now. But we are thinking all the time. We're having conversations all the time about her vulnerability style and leverage that might work with her to surface her heart. Okay, I want to leave some time for questions, and it's already 7:30. So let me just give you, the handout I gave you has some examples of sideways strategies for not only surfacing those destructive bugs, but also uprooting them, destroying them in some cases. Let me give you a few samplers, and then if you have any questions about what's on there, we can talk about that too. So I mentioned the shrewd process already. This is something that will help you to surface those destructive bugs, and that's the first step. The other thing that is helpful for a destructive narrative, this is going to sound funny, but it's hard, sweaty, physical labor of any kind. When I say kids need more work, I don't mean more schoolwork. That is all here. We're talking about their bodies being engaged. When your body is engaged, listen to this, you get in touch with your survival mechanisms again. And I just said, in an affluent culture, our life force has shifted into performance rather than surviving. And our survival instinct is a good recalibrator. So if your kids are involved in hard, sweaty work, it helps them recalibrate their interior story. Physicality is remarkably important in the uprooting of destructive narratives. If they are not physical, they are in their performance mindset, and the weed will keep growing. So there's lots of ways you can be physical. I've given you some on that handout. One way we do this in our family is outside and inside chores. One out of financial necessity, and one because we are convicted and believe in this. We don't have a house cleaner and we don't have a lawn service. The whole family participates in those two things because it's hard work. When your daughter's cleaning her own toilet, that is a good connection bridge into her survival personality. Cleaning the toilet. So find excuses for them to be physical so that they sweat. That's the real key. They're physical enough that they actually sweat. So, by the way, there is a ready supply of a necessity of physical labor on Nextdoor. There are always elderly people. My daughter every summer works almost every weekend for some elderly person who needs yard work done. Just go to Nextdoor. It's a great way to earn money. Old people pay well, as it turns out. And so get them connected with a few summer jobs that require hard physical labor. Go to Nextdoor. Hard things also rivet your attention on the present, and it's the future and the past that are dangerous. When we dwell on the past or the future, we are fertilizing destructive narratives in our life. If you can rivet on the present as much as possible, the destructive bug doesn't have much power because your attention is caught up in the thing that you're doing right now that's really hard, right? It shoves out the voice of the destructive narrative. So, another thing that's related to this is get outdoors more. I just saw this morning, before we came here today, there's a Japanese practice. It's called forest bathing. In Japanese, it's called Shinrin Yoku. And it's based on science that says if you get out in nature, out in the forest, it has a huge host of psychological, emotional benefits. It's not just that you're in a beautiful place. There's some surprising stuff here. I did not know that trees exude a certain kind of oil to keep parasitic bugs away. And when you're in a forest, your body actually gets coated with a thin layer of this tree oil that trees emit, and it actually has properties that boost your immune system and your emotional health. Isn't that crazy? But they found a host of positive impacts from forest bathing. It's a stress reducer. It reduces depression. It boosts your immune system. It drops your blood pressure. And it makes sense because in Romans 1, again, Paul says that everything in the created world is implanted with the personality of God, his personality and characteristics. God is so kind and humble. He's planted his very personality in the things around us in created nature. That's why when we're with nature, we often say, I feel close to God. It's literally true because he's planted his personality in everything that's created. So get them outside. It's not just therapeutic, it debugs them. It debugs them. All right, two more quick things. Find something that they can be responsible for outside of themselves. A pet, a person, something. Give them a responsibility. This is the reason for pet ownership, by the way. I have an obnoxious dog and an obnoxious cat. But what's so important about that is my daughters have learned responsibility to care for something outside of themselves. It redirects their attention away from here to something that needs them here. That's why equine therapy is so powerful. Kids who are suffering from anxiety and depression get used to riding horses and taking care of a horse. When they have something to care for outside of themselves, it debugs them. It shifts their attention away from their destructive narrative. All right, last thing. It's just a plea. It's a plea as much to myself as to anyone. No more snowplow parenting. It's the new term that psychologists have come up with to try to describe what is a common parenting style in our culture, which is to snowplow in front of our kids, to remove all obstacles from their way. There's a famous story that I put in my book, Spiritual Grit, about how a man saw a butterfly struggling to get out of a cocoon, and he was so over-empathetic towards the butterfly, he cut the cocoon so it would make it easier, not realizing that doomed the butterfly because it's the struggle that allowed the butterfly's wings to strengthen and survive. When we cut out hardship from in front of our kids, we are clipping their wings. I just had a conversation with my wife right before I came here about something relative to a friend of ours who's going through something hard. And she was saying, I just wish I could fix that. And I stopped and said, you know what? This is good for him. He's going to need this down the line. The strength that he's getting right now, he's going to need it. Empathy can be a terrible foe for us as parents because it's so hard to watch your kids go through something hard. So, of course, in our family, we often come alongside our kids and help them in the hardships they're facing. but we are consciously leaning toward inviting hardship and allowing hardship into their lives. We are trying as much as we can as broken people to not rescue or snowplow in front of them, recognizing that 10 and 20 years from now, they will desperately need the strength that they get from that. So it's just a plea. If you find yourself in a default setting and you look at yourself as a snowplow in front of your kids, recognize that what feels good now is harming them later. There's no doubt about it. The science, the psychology, everything tells us this is true. Our kids need more hardship because in an affluent culture, we exist to remove it because we can. Any society in the history of the world that had the resources we have would have removed hardship from their kids' lives. They're no different than us. They just didn't have the means. We do. So we have to go countercultural. And in our family, we try to allow hardship into our kids' lives and not rescue as much as possible. Okay. So there's probably some questions that you have that weren't addressed here. And I know that we're already 7:40.
Yeah, we're all right.
Sorry for that.
We're good. We're good.
So any questions you have, just throw out anything you want. As long as you can stay, I will be here too. Yeah.
Have you talked about vulnerability styles for kids? Like that?
Yeah.
Do you have specific things that you and your wife kind of came up
Oh, that's good.
with? Kind of
Yeah.
talk about that.
If I did, I would have written a book about it because that would be brilliant. Yeah. So she's asking the vulnerability styles. Have we created names for it? Yeah. Let me just think of this on the fly. So with my older daughter Lucy, authenticity, focus, and touch are huge things for her. Like even now, she's a sophomore in college. When she comes home, if we're out at a restaurant or watching a movie or something, she will sit next to me and just rest her head on my shoulder and my neck. She's just very physically intimate, and she has a real trust level. So because of that, I know that when I speak directly and authentically to her from my heart, she receives it. If it's not from my heart, she's not paying attention. So my younger daughter, Emma, exactly the opposite. If it's from my heart, she's embarrassed. That's weird. You always say that, Dad. Is everything about Jesus, Dad? I mean, she just said this to me this afternoon. So she has this toward that, right? So in my daughter's style is, I don't know what I'd call it, but it's writing. So when she writes me a birthday card, oh my gosh, it's amazing. I have to ask her, do you really believe this? Of course I do, Dad. Well, I don't say this, but inside I want to say, well, you never say this. But she writes it. She'll write it. So she processes vulnerability. She needs a little bit of distance. So writing helps her keep some distance and allows her to be vulnerable. And she needs a third thing almost all the time. A third thing that's really capturing her attention so she doesn't realize the questions we're asking and how we're fueling the direction she's going. And we have to tippy-toe with her. Like she had a sort of boyfriend for a little while who was not a good guy. And but we were, had to feel our way forward there because if we went frontal, it would not work with her. And we were concerned about this. So we went sideways and got her talking about it. And eventually she saw it for what it was. So he was also trying to plant destructive narratives in her life, which really concerned us. We wanted to get her talking so that she would surface the narratives herself. And as gently as we could, we tried to compare those against the truth and let her figure that out. She has to do a lot of the work herself, I guess is a way of saying it. We can't do a lot of that for her, so we have to figure out how to do that. Sorry, that's a terrible answer to your question, but who else? Yes?
A lot of the questions that we have up on this
Yeah.
board right here are surrounding the social media and how
Yeah.
cool it is to think about suicide, or how cool it is to think about LGBTQ, or how cool it is to think that they need to have sex at a young age.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how to recognize those signs and how to do it?
So he's asking about messages, especially communicated through social media and technology, that are normalizing things. So when you say it's cool to, I'd say it's more like normalizing certain beliefs and values and behaviors in our culture. The more you treat them as normal, the more you normalize them. So they are surrounded by those things. But here's good news for you guys as parents. Now, I've been doing this for 30 years. Researchers know what I'm about to say, and Josh mentioned it at the start. Your influence in your kids' lives way outpaces any other influence, even as teenagers. It is not true that a teenager's peer group has more influence than you. Even if they seem to say so to you, it's not true. Your orbital center, whatever you value and love the most, is what's really infecting them. And I use the word infect on purpose. People get infected by our presence. Whatever it is we most care about, they are getting it. So you still have more power than all of these influences. But these norms can be like Trojan horses that creep in, attach themselves to their identity. Like there's a movement now amongst kids here that were connected to the Columbine shooting, that their movement is called The Last Shot. And I find this intriguing. They have, on their driver's license, they have put an instruction that says, if you find me and I have been killed as a result of gun violence, take my picture and give it to the media. What they're trying to do is undermine the public's impression of, this sounds so funny to say, but the glamour of violence, either in suicide or homicide. They're trying to expose people and get it in their face how ugly and horrific this is, to try to undermine this. There's another movement about not naming shooters in school shootings and mass shootings and things like that. So these things are normalized. In some cases, they're glamorized. The only way to find out whether some of those things have glommed onto them is to do the first thing I said, which is to somehow get into the light those beliefs, those norms. So they have to be surfaced somehow. And then to pluck them out, what helps is, I just talked to a friend of mine about this. What helped him, he was sexually abused as a kid, and he told me that one of the ways that trauma created a weed in his life that destroyed his relationships. So one way that helped him is that as that came to light for him, he started comparing it to what Jesus said about who he was. And the more he compared it, the more he saw dissonance between the two, and that caused him to pursue, why is it that I believe this about myself when Jesus says this is true about me? I don't understand why I persist in this belief. So it raised the comparable to him, got it onto the surface, and that's where the weed, you can start yanking on it a little bit. Start to yank on it once it's out there. And the best thing would be for them to start yanking on it, for them to say, like my friend did, hey, this weed has grown up in my life. I think it's persistent because it shouldn't be there, because Jesus is telling this about me. Yes?
Would you be able to speak to these addictive video games such as Fortnite and how it may affect or contribute to this destructive narrative in a sideways
Yeah.
way? Because it is so
Yep.
addictive, especially Fortnite.
Yeah. There are, I think I just saw this last week, there are 200 million gaming consoles in America today, and there's only 330 million people. So it's ubiquitous. You're asking about the influence of Fortnite and other sort of addictive games and technologies. So using the word addictive is not just a throwaway word. I am in other situations with parents in school systems and other things where this comes up. And many parents literally have kids who are diagnostically addicted to their technology, to texting, to video gaming. At its most extreme, kids who are addicted need addicted counseling. They need counseling for addiction. And there are many practices now that help with video gaming, texting, other forms of technological addiction. But for the most part, kids are not all the way to that extreme. They're just spending a lot of time on it. So there is no other way around this, I have to say. So the one thing I tell parents is if somebody came into your house and took a bowl out of your kitchen cabinet and poured a bunch of cocaine into the bowl and said, "Can I leave this here on your kitchen counter?" You'd say, "Of course not." So look, these things can be addictive. So there's only one solution for parents, and that's to set boundaries around them. And that means, wow, I'm tired already. Are you kidding me? I got to fight that battle? Yes, we have to fight that battle. I know other parents who've had kids addicted to drugs, and the battle that comes after the addiction is way worse than the battle you spend before it happens. It seems hard if you don't have to do it. So that means restricting screen time. In your handout, I have a little bullet there that talks about non-screen activities. It's not just saying no to one thing, you have to say yes to another. So you can't just say no to this without offering other alternatives to that. So offer alternatives to it. In our family, this is going to sound so ridiculous, but it's what we do. We've had a tradition of board game night every Saturday night our whole life, until my daughter left for college, and it kind of destroyed the whole 4-person game night thing. But we played board games, every Saturday night. And it took up the space that something else would have taken. And board games are great because they involve face-to-face interaction. That's called, that board games are a hot medium. They create a lot of heat relationally. So that's what we've done. We find an alternative to that space that is much more interactive, and it's much more deeply satisfying than a video game. But I know, especially for boys, Fortnite is like crack cocaine for them. It's a great question. Who else? Yes.
I just have a favor. Can you continue to do these sessions?
Oh, jeez. Oh, thanks.
Maybe a small group.
Yeah, when Josh and I talked about this, I said, we're going to have an hour for this, and this is it's going to be an eye blink. Yeah, because there's so much going on here, and I really understand that. And I don't want it to seem like even the things I'm saying now are like flipping a switch, or these are all things that are human. It's about our identity as parents and how we're growing and what courage we have. And man, we're spending our courage in 20 different directions every day. I got to have courage for that. So I wrote Spiritual Grit as a way of saying that we don't have the strength we need. We need grit, but we don't have enough of it on our own, so we need the grit that Jesus has, his strength. So,
And like I said earlier, this is not the one and only. This is the first of many, for sure. Because this is such a great resource for you guys, and even for myself to hear. For me, and I'm not saying my parents were perfect, but everything Rick talked about is what my parents did for me. Me and my brothers, quick story, forgot to take the trash out, and then my dad woke up at like 1 o'clock in the morning and made a mud pit that we went and did physical training in, as my mom sat on the porch in her rocking chair. So, I'm not saying go that far, but a lot of the stuff that he says is even stuff that I've been raised on that comes out in my communication to students. And I know it works because I've, like all of us, have gone through some struggles, and I've witnessed parents doing what we talked about, snowplow some of my friends' life where my parents said, "Here's a shovel." And I just think, again, it's just fantastic.
So just as a tiny little illustration there, Spiritual Grit starts out with a story about me walking my daughter to the bus stop every day and noticing that there were these big SUVs with soccer moms driving them that would pull up and park with their idling in cold weather until their son jumped out and went to the bus stop. And 3 of these would park there every day during cold weather. And it finally just boiled over me, and I said to my daughter as I'm walking, "This is driving me crazy." And she said, "Dad, you're so weird. What is wrong?" And I said, these moms are thinking that they're helping their sons, but it's about 7 minutes in the cold that they're saving them from. They must let their sons walk to the bus stop and experience the hardship of cold, because Jesus loves us now and in the future at the same moment. So something that will explain a lot of the tough stuff in your life is that Jesus is loving you right now, but he also knows you in the future, and he's loving you then too. And he will not do something now that will harm you there. He won't do it. So our parenting style, if it becomes more like Jesus, we see hardship as beneficial, like keeping their marriage together 20 years from now beneficial. So we invite it, especially when it's nothing, like 7 minutes in the cold at a bus stop. When the hardship is nothing, let it happen. That's the best way to say it. Let it happen. Because kids experiencing making it through difficult circumstances, they have that to draw on in the future as well, right? Oh, I did that. My daughter Emma went to Spain with some of her friends. She did that. She figured stuff out. She fell down on the street and really scraped herself up. She figured out how to get medical care. While she was in Spain, she figured stuff out because she was in a hard situation. It's so good. So as much as possible, especially if it makes no difference, let the hardship in. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that kind of exceeds our time limit.
Yeah,
a little
totally.
bit.
Sorry about that, you guys.
Before you guys leave, I do want to do one thing. I want to pray
Yeah.
for this generation, because this isn't something that, like Rick talked about, gets fixed with the switch of a light flicker or whatever it is. This is something that takes constant steps. So let's pray. Man, Jesus, God, thank you so much for this opportunity. God, thank you so much for this time together. God, thank you so much for this resource and this knowledge to know more about how to make and how to help our students see you in their struggle. And to rely on you to help them and to find that relationship with you, God. Thank you so much for Rick and his time, and thank you so much for these parents who just simply are willing to say, hey, Jesus, we need some help, and we need it now. And God, so just continue to help us, continue to encourage us, and continue to inspire us. Christian, we pray. Amen. Can we give it up for Rick one time? Amen. Thank you so much.